Edexcel Economics Paper 2 2022. Let's get right on with it and get on with section A. So let's get started. Let's get started straight on with the first question. Using the information above, calculate the total reduction. So it's a calculate question, 4 marks, which sounds like a very easy question, but let's see what it's saying. To calculate the total reduction in the UK's GDP from a fall in government spending of 20 million. Okay, and then the stimulus has given us the UK's MPC, so the marginal propensity to consume, is estimated to be 0.64. Now, a lot of you will be confused looking at this question, and this is a question that many students did not get anywhere near full marks on, and sometimes picked up the first 2 marks, but then the last 2 marks were very rare to see that a student picked up. So let's see how we would go about answering this. So firstly, it's given us the marginal propensity to consume. It's asking us to calculate the total reduction in the UK's GDP. What formula do we use the marginal propensity to consume in? That would, of course, be the multiplier formula, and that's what should remind you of. So even if this question is quite difficult, you need to try patch together what it's asking you, and one way to do that is, where do we use the MPC formula? Of course, we use MPC in the multiplier formula, and now for a few of you this will start making a lot more sense. And of course, the multiplier formula is 1 divided by 1 take away MPC, and now let's put that into the calculator, as we already do have our MPC number, which is 0.64, and that will give us, if you don't know what you can see, but that will give us 2.77, and I'm just going to write that out just to make sure. And like with these calculated questions, just make sure, always show you're working, as even if you don't get full marks, you will pick up a few marks. So 2.77, so probably just 2.78 I'm going to write it as. So now that is the value of the multiplier. But now, what can we do with this information? Since that is not going to get us the 4 marks, it's asking us to calculate the total reduction in the UK's GDP. Whenever in economics you're talking about the multiplier ratio, you're talking about how initial increase in maybe government spending is going to lead to further amplified effects in the economy, almost compound effects in the economy. Like a classic example is the UK Olympics, where the UK spent around 8.8 billion on the London Olympics, and it actually managed to increase real GDP by around 16.5 billion, which obviously shows a great and a massive multiplier. And this is essentially what this question is asking you, but instead of asking you about a positive multiplier effect, it's asking you about a negative multiplier effect. So all we need to do for this question is take that 2.7 recurring and times it by 20 million. Because why? That is going to tell us, because we've got the multiplier ratio here, and then we've got the fall in government spending of course 20 million. So what is that going to give us then? That is going to give us a total reduction in real GDP. And that gives me a number like this, which is lots of 5s, but I'm just going to round it up. Of course, this is in millions. If you do want to make it simpler, you can obviously just times it by 20. And that, if you times it by 20, that is what it's going to look like. And that is obviously a lot easier, is what I did originally. So that is going to give me 55.5 recurring. So I'm going to have 55.56. And of course, that is in millions. And that is, what does that now represent? That represents the total reduction in GDP. And of course, we always need to remember units. I've got the millions, but what have I not got here? It's talking about GDP, and GDP is of course in pounds, even though I'm a bit dodgy at drawing the pound symbol. But yeah, make sure you've got your units, so the millions and the pounds. Then I've labelled it total reduction in GDP, got all my working as well, so that should get me, and that will get me, the 4 out of 4 marks there. And if you didn't get this first time, do not worry. This is why we do past papers. Would you rather see this now and not get it now, or would you rather see it in your actual exam when it actually matters? Now that's the best thing. This question could repeat in your actual exam now, and since you've done it once, you'll know how to do it, meaning that, of course, that's exactly what we want. But yeah, so that is the first part of the first question of section A done. And now let's move on to part B in this first question. So which of the following is an injection into the circular flow of income? And there's a cool acronym to learn these injections and withdrawals. I've gone through it in a previous video, but injections are GICs, so government spending, and then withdrawals are SIT. Of course, you don't need this for this question, but just for a bit of revision, which are savings. So of course, it's not going to be imports, it is going to be investments, it's not going to be savings, and it's not going to be taxation, as these 3 are all withdrawals, thus meaning the answer is B, and that is how to get 5 out of 5 marks on the first question. And let's move on to the next question. So is with reference, let's go straight to the question. With reference to the chart, which of the following is true? And let's quickly analyse the chart. So annual percentage change in UK average house prices. We start from May 2018 to May 2021. And just a quick analysis of the graph, we see a spike here, and we see, of course, after pretty much between May and August 2020, there's a massive spike. Okay, let's assess A. So did average house prices fall in August 2020? Of course, that is not what the graph is showing. Moving on to B, average house prices fell in November 2018. Let's have a look at November 2018. So if you look from there, house prices are actually, when we get to November 2018, they are rising. So I would not, so that therefore that is not correct. And again, this is just exam technique. Like, I 100% understand students that will see this and see the decline and think that, okay, house prices have fallen in November 2018. But of course, anything after this point is no longer November 2018, of course, but it's just exam technique. So if Edexcel throws this in again, you know that now this is kind of how they assess it. So again, don't worry too much if you're getting these questions wrong. In practice, it's all about just that repetition of practice. And then May 2021, it rose the fastest. We do see a very steep rise in May 2021. I'm going to label that right, but there might be another slightly right answer. But yeah, let's see. In D, it stayed constant in 2018. The problem with that is that we only have data from May 2018, so we don't really know. And of course, it's not staying constant either, so therefore that is wrong. So therefore, yeah, the answer would be C. Okay, so moving on to the next question. It's a 4-mark question again. So with the reference to the chart on the previous page, explain question, the likely impact of an increase in the average house prices on UK consumption. So this is just a straight content knowledge question. It's talking about house prices and then the effects on consumption. And what is the first thing that you want coming to your mind? What is this explaining? This is explaining the concept of the wealth effect. So the way I'd word it is an increase in average house prices in the UK is going to lead to a positive wealth effect. And what is that positive wealth effect going to lead to? If individuals are experiencing a positive wealth effect, if you believe your assets are worth more, your house is worth more, that is quite literally the concept of consumer confidence. If everything you have is worth more, it's going to increase your consumer confidence, and if there's increased consumer confidence, you're going to lead to an increase in consumption. And when the positive wealth effect occurs, let's think about it. If you own a house, I know it might not be very realistic for you, but let's think about your parents. The house your parents own, if that's worth more in value, if it goes up by like 10%, so for example, on a £500,000 house, that's 50,000, your house has increased in value. Are you going to feel more confident or less confident in the economy? You're going to feel more confident, are you? And that's the exact concept of consumer confidence. When consumers' assets rise, since they have almost more money to fall back on, their consumer confidence rises. And of course, with increased consumer confidence, what's the question asking about? It's asking about consumption, thus meaning there's going to lead to an increase in consumption. And of course, always remember, in this 4 marks, it's asked you with reference to the chart, so there will be at least 1 mark for application. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to go to the chart and find an example of an increase in house prices. And what I'm going to say, I'm going to probably use this figure because it's the first one I've seen. In May 2021, what was this? This looks like about 11%. So the annual percentage change in average house prices in the UK in May 2021 was 11%. And this, again, this is why I emphasize practicing past papers so much. This is exam technique, since you need to quote the data correctly, because you can't just quote anything off the data. You need to see what the graph, this table, is actually showing you, and then you're able to quote that and pick up the application mark. Since you just said there's been an 11% increase in house prices, that doesn't make sense. It's annual percentage change in house prices on average in the UK. So make sure you read what's on the axes and actually quote the data correctly. And that would be enough for 4 out of 4 on that question. And that is question 2 and how to get 5 marks on question 2. And let's move on to question 3. So this looks like quite an interesting chart. And let's have a read of it. So with reference to the chart above, explains an explain question, and again another 4-mark question, explain the likely impact of a reduction in the base interest rate on UK investment. Now that sounds like a very good question. And okay, and the graph is showing Bank of England base interest rates between 2016 and 2020. So pretty much the exact same structure as the last question. There's gonna be 1 mark for application here because it of course says with the reference to the chart. So I would just quote one scenario when there has been a reduction in the base interest rate. So anywhere pretty much that you can see a reduction. And what is a classic chain of analysis we know for lower interest rates or a reduction in the base interest rate is that a reduction in the interest rate is going to lead to a reduction in the incentive to save as you get less return on saving, and an increase incentive to spend. Why? Because there's a lower cost of borrowing. And if there is a low cost of borrowing, the question is specifically asking about UK investment and who is going to be investing into the UK. If you think about the AD formula, C plus I plus G, X minus M, it's going to be firms. Those firms are more incentivized to invest. And that is all you need for your content knowledge marks. You've explained it very step by step perfectly. And now we just need to get 1 mark for my application. So where am I going to quote the application? So there's here where there's a drop in interest rates. There's here, of course, when there's drop in interest rates. So anywhere, well, those 2 scenarios would get you the mark. So here in 2020, we saw interest rate fall from 0.75 to then, what did it fall to? It fell to 0.1. So you can, and that's what you want to say. So in June 2020, interest rates fell from 0.75 to 0.1. That is all you need to get 4 out of 4 marks on this question. And now let's move on to the next question. So which of the following would be most likely to result from lower base interest rates? And these questions, always be really careful with these multiple choice questions. Make sure you focus on this thing, because the question's basically asking you something, but then they give you like an other variable to the scenario. So essentially, a lower interest rate is going to result in a fall in, and then you need to think about it like that. So a fall in the average price of houses. Let's think about this. Most people in the UK purchase houses via mortgages. I know, of course, mortgages have a significant relationship with interest rates. If there's lower interest rates, that means mortgages are going to be cheaper. If mortgages are cheaper, it means more people can get a mortgage, which means more people can buy houses. If more people can buy houses, this, if we think about a simple supply and demand diagram, if more people can buy houses, this is going to lead to a shift out of the demand for houses. And if you look at this diagram now, if there's a shift out in demand of houses, prices increase from P1 to P2. So due to a lower interest rates and then its effect on mortgages, there's actually going to be an increase in the average price of houses and not a decrease. So that, therefore, A would be wrong. Let's think about B, a fall in the external value of the pound. So what is the relationship between the pound and interest rates? Of course, that would be the concept of hot money. So a fall in interest rates is going to lead to foreign investors taking money out of the UK and moving it to another country which has higher relative interest rates. Why? Since when there's a fall in interest rates, there's a reduced return on savings. Therefore, foreign investors who put their money, that use hot money, that put their money in countries with the highest relative interest rates, will move their money out of the UK as they're not getting as much return on their savings now. And let's see what happens to this on an exchange rate diagram. So exchange rate on the y-axis and quantity of pounds on the x-axis. Then we have a simple supply and demand diagram. And of course, if foreign investors are trying to get rid of the UK pounds on the forex markets, it means they're going to be selling off more of the UK pounds, which means the supply of UK pounds is going to increase from S to S plus 1. And now let's see how that affects interest rates, exchange rates. So exchange rates decrease from ER1 to now ER2. Thus, a fall in the interest rates is going to lead to a fall in the external value of the pound, which is what the statement says, which is true. But now, just for completion's sake, let's go through the rest of them. Now, this is actually a really good question for revision, and let's think about C now. So, the level of employment will decrease when there is a lower interest rate. But lower interest rates, what do we say? What is the main effect? It increases consumption. And what is consumption? We say consumption is around 60% of the AD formula. And of course, if you have an increase in consumption and consumption is 60% of AD, what is going to happen to AD? It's going to, of course, lead to a shift out of AD from AD to AD1, and then a shift out of AD. How is that going to affect real GDP? Real GDP is going to increase from YE to Y1. And what does an increase in real GDP mean? It means there's more goods and services being produced in the UK, and if there's more goods and services being produced, how do we produce these goods and services? Via factors of production, and one of the main factors of production that produces goods and services is labour. So there's more GDP. This will therefore lead to an increase in derived demand for labour, and of course, if there's more derived demand for labour, this leads to an increase in employment, and this says there's going to be a fall in the levels of employment, thus meaning that C is not correct. And this chain of analysis also explains D. So D says there's a fall in the rate of economic growth, whereas in reality we have seen that due to the increase in consumption, there's going to be an increase in real GDP, thus meaning D is not correct, which of course means our answer is B. And of course, in your exam, do not do all this for a 1 mark question, just get the answer and move on. But it's really good using these past paper questions for revision and just making sure your chain of analysis, your content knowledge is up to scratch. Okay, so that is 3 done, and that's how to get 5 out of 5 marks on question 3. And now let's move on to question 4. So we've got a business cycle diagram here, and so at point Z on the diagram, which of the following is likely to occur? So trade cycle, business cycle, whatever you want to call it. So looking at the diagram, what is point Z actually representing? If you know your content knowledge, you should know that is a boom stage of the economy. So at the boom stage of the economy, what is likely to happen? An increase in absolute poverty? No, since in a boom stage, there's likely to be a decrease in absolute poverty, since what is the characteristic of a boom stage? High levels of employment, increases in real GDP, which of course increases in employment. I don't know whether I said that or not, but that of course would lead to a decrease in poverty levels. Moving on to B, would there likely be an increase in the budget deficit? No, there would likely be we'd move closer towards a balanced budget. Since why? And it all goes back to the characteristics of a boom, since like I said, higher levels of employment. If there's high levels of employment, there's higher levels of income tax. High levels of income tax means the government has more tax revenue, and then there's increased economic growth, which means firms are doing well, which means government receives higher levels of corporation tax, again more tax revenue for the government. And then on the opposite side of the spectrum, since there's increased employment, it means that government have to pay less benefits out, thus meaning they're spending less and they're getting more tax revenue. So that, therefore, B would be wrong, as we would actually be moving closer to a balanced budget rather than our budget deficit getting worse. And then C, there would be an increase in cyclical unemployment. That is, of course, wrong, as there would be a decrease in cyclical unemployment. When we get cyclical unemployment, it's the opposite, is in the recession stage of the business cycle. And lastly, there would be an increase in inflation, which would be correct. Why? Massive increase in employment, real GDP, and that is going to lead to a massive increase in consumption, and a massive increase in consumption is, of course, going to lead to AD increasing from AD to AD1, and we call it demand pull inflation. So there's massive, in our boom stages of the economy, there is massive levels of demand pull inflation. So yeah, therefore A is correct. Now another 4-mark question. So with reference to the diagram, this is like a very good question. Explain, 4 marks for explain, the difference between automatic stabilizers and discretionary fiscal policy. Now, I really hope there's a lot of people at this stage of the video, because this is such a neglected part of the spec. It's a very small additional detail to fiscal policy, but like it shows here, it can be assessed. So now, if you don't know what this question's on about, if you maybe haven't revised this is your sign, and this is the opportunity. You need to revise this, as it does come up, and it could come up in a large question. It could come up in a 10-mark question, a 15-mark question, and then you're really, if you have no idea what these are, you could risk dropping a grade. So 100% make sure you revise these, and I'm actually quite happy this has come up, since it's usually a bit neglected by students. And for the hard workers who are aiming for the A-star, everyone should be aiming for the A-star, but of course you need to put in the work for the A-star. Automatic stabilizers act as a great evaluation point whenever you're talking about any topics around fiscal policy. Let's start with discretionary fiscal policy, and the clues in the name. Discretionary fiscal policy is when the government use their discretion, is when they deliberately engage in a policy. So as we're talking about discretionary fiscal policy, is when the government deliberately make changes to the levels of taxation or the levels of government spending to influence the economy. Whereas automatic stabilizers is the complete opposite, where the government has no direct influence, they're not actively making a change, but there are changes to the levels of taxation or government spending. And the best way to remember this is 100% using the business cycle diagram. And let's think about automatic stabilizers first. So the role of automatic stabilizers is to cushion demand in the boom. Why are we trying to cushion demand in the boom? So at this stage of the business cycle, we're trying to cushion the demand. Why is that? Since if demand grows too large, what do we get? We get massive demand pull inflation, and that can lead to, eventually can lead to hyperinflation, and that's of course something we want to avoid. As again, you can relate that to COVID stats in 2022, around 2022 to 2023, the UK had 8 consecutive months of double-digit inflation, and of course you do not want very high levels of inflation. But yeah, so one role of automatic stabilizers is to cushion demand in the boom, but then in the recession they try to increase demand, because of course in recessions GDP decreases massively, so you want to push demand up in recessions, whereas in booms you want to pull that down. And let's think about the theory behind that. Since we don't want business cycles that look like this, which are, that's actually a very bad drawing. We don't want business cycles that look like this, which are massive booms and then crazy recessions. Because what is that going to affect? It's going to massively affect living standards. What we want is steady business cycles. Yes, of course we will be going through recessions and booms, but we don't want one day you're living in a mansion and then the next day you don't have enough food to eat, because that is what would happen if we had massive booms and massive recessions. Of course, maybe not that extreme. But then, best real world application to think about this, automatic stabilizers, where can we see them cushioning demand in the boom? Of course, our income tax rates. So our income tax is progressive, thus meaning the more you earn, the more tax you pay. So it means that as real GDP is increasing, there's an increased employment in the boom. It doesn't just mean people are basically gaining substantial sums of money. it means that, yes, they're going to be earning more money, but the actual increase won't be as large since they're going to be paying a lot more tax. That therefore means there's a lesser increase in consumption than there would be if there were no progressive income tax rates, meaning that helps cushion demand in the boom. And then the polar opposite, in recessions, of course, one main characteristic is very high unemployment. What do we have in recessions? We have benefits, we have things like job seekers allowance, universal credit. And why does that help increase demand in the recession? As it means that individuals will have still have some sort of income, so their consumption doesn't completely like die and disappear. So it means that it keeps GDP at a decent level, and it, like I said, it helps stop those fluctuations in the business cycle. So there, I've given you more than you need to know for the question, so I'm just going to write out what I would write here for the 4 marks of this question. But again, this is my section here, very good revision for content knowledge. And for 4 marks, this is how I would word this question. And remember, always you have a mark for application here. With this question, it's very easy to get the application since you're pretty much going to refer to the positive, negative, the boom or a recession, so you will pick up quite easily. But the way I'd worded it, discretionary fiscal policy is when the government use their discretion, so use their decision making they actively make a direct change which influences the levels of tax and government spending. Now that is a mistake a few students made, is that of course the question is specifically referring to fiscal policy, so you do need to of course talk about the components of fiscal policy, which is tax and government spending. So it is a bit overlooked, but make sure you do mention that. And then I contrast it with what automatic stabilizers are, whereas automatic stabilizers is when government spending / taxation increase or decrease, so like basically change without any direct government involvement or intervention. And the best example of that is a decrease in income tax during a recession / negative output gap due to less employment. And just to make sure you understand that, of course, during a recession, the government does not decrease the rate. They do not decrease income tax from 20% to 15%, but because there are less people working, it means the actual income tax revenue they gain is less, even though they haven't made any change in the policies. But yeah, that is how to get 4 out of 4 marks on that question, and that is 5 out of 5 for question 4. And let's move on to the next question, which is the last section here, and question 5. Another 4-mark question, and it is on financial markets. So with reference to the information, so you will have 1 mark for application. Explain one role of the financial market. And again, a really good question on another neglected part of the spec. I must get this question about 100 times every single year, even more probably, in the hundreds, 100%, where students ask me, should I revise financial markets? Is it high yield? But especially, like I say, every student should be, if you're aiming for the A stars, financial markets work as a really good evaluation point, so 100% would learn it. And this is all about preparation. You should be putting enough time in that you have time to cover all the topics. Like, for example, financial markets, things like moral hazard, systemic risk, too big to fail the banks, they work as really good evaluation points in certain essays, so 100% would dedicate the time to learning the topic of financial market. And just to emphasise why I tell students, you need to pretty much know every single point in the spec, since you could be assessed on anything. The question is asking us, explain one role of financial markets, 4 marks. Let's see what the spec says. The spec says, what do you need to know? We need to know the role of financial markets. Then it tells us the 5 roles we need. So if you knew the spec, and if you knew the spec points, these would be easy marks. And let's go back to the question. And so what does the stimulus tell us? It tells us the UK government introduced a loan scheme to help small businesses survive the downturn in the economy. Okay, so of course May 2020 would have been COVID lockdown time. Small businesses could borrow up to 50,000 at a like 2.5% interest rate, which is a low interest rate, for up to 6 years from the bank. The government guaranteed 100% of these loans to help enable the banks to issue them quickly, and only minimal checks were made on borrowers. So now, the question is asking us, with reference to the information, explain one role of financial markets. So what role of financial markets does this look like? A, B, C, D, or E? And of course, B is quite relevant. So like I say, just to emphasise this, is that please do make sure, go through your spec, and you do need to, if you want to be confident, you want to get those A stars, you need to be confident and be able to recall pretty much every single point on the spec, since it could be tested on absolutely anything. So one role of financial markets is to lend to businesses and consumers. And why do we want to do that? For businesses, of course, we want them to allow them to increase investment, and for consumers, so they can spend more, so basically increase consumption. And of course, with this stimulus, it's given us a lot of application. And why do we want businesses to invest and consumers to spend? Since, of course, what's it mentioned here is mentioned there's a downturn in the economy. So they basically made it easier for businesses to borrow in the downturn of the economy, which makes a lot of sense, since we want businesses to continue to invest. We want them to continue to invest to keep stimulating AD when there is a downturn, when there is a recession. As just like with the previous question, with the business cycle question, we do not want the recession to be too deep and to reduce the fluctuations in that business cycle. So the way to finish that off is just, like I said, pick up the application mark and just added a bit of analysis there. So this is done as E.G to help small businesses survive the downturn in the economic cycle. What does that actually mean? As what happens during a downturn, of course, real GDP decreases, AD decreases, and why does AD decrease? Of course, lower levels of consumption, lower levels of investment, and how does this affect firms? It means firms' sales, firms' profits decrease. But yeah, that is all we need to get 4 out of 4 marks there. And like I said, the main takeaway from that is please do revise every point of spec, and specifically the ones you don't want to, they still can come up as equally as much as the ones that you like. So yeah, let's move on to the next question, which is a multiple choice question, and let's see what this is saying. So which of the following would be a risk if only minimum checks were made on borrowers in this loan scheme? So that is referring to the end of this extract. Let's start with A, which is asymmetric information. What is asymmetric information? It's when one party in a transaction knows more than another party in a transaction. And why would that be a risk if only minimal checks were made on borrowers? As for example, if I'm a business, if I'm a firm, and I'm borrowing £100,000, but I know that it's very unlikely that I'm able to pay that £100,000 back, that is a risk, isn't it? And since I know more in that transaction, there's asymmetric information. Me as a borrower knows I probably won't be able to pay that back, but the person who is giving that money, the bank, doesn't know that, because yet again they've done minimal checks. Thus meaning this therefore would be correct. But let's, for revision's sake, go through the rest. B is crowding out. That is where there's an increase in government spending, which increases interest rates, which leads to the private sector being crowded out. They can't invest as much, but that has basically nothing to do with this question, so it would therefore not be B. Moving on to C, market rigging. This is where firms fix prices. Of course, that is not relevant to the question again. And then D, speculation. Speculation, again, is it anything to do with the question? No. Therefore, the answer for 5B would be asymmetric information, and that is question 5 done, and that is section A for June 2022, paper 2. June 2022, section B. Let's get right on with it. So going straight to the questions like we always do, we'll get started with this 5-mark question. So using a Lorenz curve diagram, so we're going to have to draw the diagram, explain how income inequality is measured using the Gini coefficient. Refer to extract A in your answer. Okay, so this looks like quite a good question, and it, again, 5-mark questions. The way I class a good question for a 5-mark question is something you can do fast. And this looks like, especially just simple content or treacle, if you know the Lorenz curve, you should be able to get this done fairly fast. Okay, so let's get started. So Lorenz curve is the one diagram that you're going to draw it like. It's kind of the axis is the other way around. So of course, the main thing that students will mess up with the Lorenz curve is the axis. Of course, there's lots of other mistakes. It's a very under-revised diagram. This diagram, I emphasize it so much since it's so good to use in evaluation, and you can pretty much throw it in anywhere. Macro objectives, it works really well, and especially when you're able to link it to the Gini coefficient. You learn a few Gini coefficients like South Africa, UK, just different countries, of course, different levels of inequality. You're able to contrast them. Really good evaluation, and if you're using a diagram in evaluation, you pick up lots of marks. But anyway, so on the y-axis we have cumulative percentage of income of the population, and then on the x-axis you have cumulative percentage of the population. And then of course we have a straight, almost like 90-degree line. And what does this straight red line represent? This represents perfect income equality. And simple explanation, if you look at the cumulative, say that's 50% of the population, there's 50% of the income there. If you look at 1% of the population, there's 1% of the income there. So it's proportional. And then we have our second curve, which is of course our Lorenz curve, which is a bit more bendy and it's more of a curve shape. Looks something like that, and 100% you need to level that up. Lorenz curve. Now, of course, the question has asked us to use the Gini coefficient, and how would we include the Gini coefficient here? Of course, you do need to remember the formula. What is the formula for Gini coefficient? It's A divided by A plus B. And now, where is A and where is B? Simply just A is a section between the perfect income equality curve and then the Lorenz curve, then B is the rest of the area. But now, since it's a 5-mark question, it has asked us to refer to the extract, and we will have to, and it is an explain question, so we will have to write a bit of chain of analysis. The main chain of analysis I would be writing here is to do with the stats. So I'm guessing in the extract, and which extract they asked us to refer to, extract A. So let's see what is in extract A. So first thing I see, the estimate for the UK's Gini coefficient value is 0.34. So that's 100% a bit of application I am going to use. And having a look at the rest of this extract, it mentions the different levels of inequality, so the north versus south inequality in the UK. But that is the main stat I am going to use from that. And then I would just back it up with a bit of analysis, a bit of content knowledge. So you need to actually be able to interpret what a Gini coefficient value means. So the higher the Gini coefficient value, what does that mean? And the lower the Gini coefficient value, what does that mean? And of course, the lower the Gini coefficient value, the less income inequality there is. So that's how I used to remember it. Lower income, lower Gini value, lower income inequality. So I've just written up the UK's Gini coefficient value and then just explained the lower a Gini value, the lower the levels of income inequality within a country. And that answer would get you the 5 out of 5 marks in this question, but I am just going to add a bit to it since this diagram, if you know how to use it, it's very high yield, especially for those long answer, the essay questions. Like I always try to emphasize, real world application is king, and examiners want to see you have an appreciation of the real world of economics. And so 2 really good examples and contrasting examples of Gini coefficient values are Norway. Norway has a Gini coefficient value of around 0.27, whereas South Africa has a Gini coefficient value of 0.63. So what does this mean? Like we said earlier, so Norway has a lower Gini coefficient value, thus incomes are more equally distributed throughout the country. There's less income inequality, whereas South Africa is the polar opposite. There is higher levels of income inequality, thus incomes are less evenly distributed within the country. Now, this is where you can really add that depth, just at that next level to your diagram, to your essay, where if you were, this works in evaluation, maybe this works in one of your essays, what I would do, I would draw something like this. So I'll draw 2 different Lorenz curves. I'll draw one like this. So this would be Norway's Lorenz curve. So let me use 2 different colours. So we'll use purple for Norway. So Norway's Lorenz curve, of course, is going to be a bit closer, whereas this is going to, so the blue one is going to be South Africa's Lorenz curve. Now, why does this make sense? Since Norway, and we're gonna label Norway red and South Africa blue. Why? Since Norway has a lower Gini coefficient value, this means Norway's Lorenz curve is going to be closer to the perfect income equality curve. As very simply, there's less income inequality within the country, so it's closer to the ideal scenario of perfect income equality. Whereas as South Africa has a higher Gini coefficient value, there's more income inequality. We represent that by showing the Lorenz curve being further away from the perfect equality curve. So it's a little thing you can add, a little bit of content knowledge, but it works really well and can really add a bit of depth to your essay and works really great in evaluation. This can help you visualize why the Gini coefficient formula works, as it's A divided by A plus B, so it does make sense. 8-mark question. So with reference to figure 1 and extract A, examine 2 likely causes of the income inequality within the UK. Now, we've already had a read of extract A, and I believe when I was scanning through it, it gave a lot of the reasons, so I'm probably just going to have a quick look at extract A again and try to find some reasons. Okay, so let's have a scan of extract A, and it said also figure 1. So there are a number of different reasons for this. First, labour in poor places tend to develop too few skills with a lack of education. So that is definitely going to be one of my reasons, because that is a decent paragraph I can write on that. And remember the question wanted 2 reasons for the income inequality. So number 1 is going to be lack of education. Then secondly, there is a lack of infrastructure. So that is all I pretty much need for my 2 paragraph points. But of course I'm going to come back to get the application, since 8-mark question, there are 2 marks reserved for application. Also, this last line is quite good for evaluation. It's easier to improve schools than persuade businesses to move to a poorer part of the country. Now, although you probably only care about this for your exams, this is real life, and as someone from the north, it definitely holds true compared to the south. So let's take these 2 reasons, and let's start with the first reason, which is lack of education. So that's going to be the start of, that's going to be a point, and then how are we going to lead that? How are we going to end up with that leads to increasing income inequality? And with lack of education, I'm just going to give this example. So 21% compared to 41% in London went to higher education. So why does the lack of education in the north, and like I said, I've just quoted, there's a 20% difference between Rotherham and London students going into under 18-year-olds going into higher education. Just lack of education, of course, would lead to a lower level of human capital. Essentially, the individual has a lower level of skills, and if this individual has a lower level of skill, his skill set is smaller than someone from the south. Therefore, this worker is defined as being less productive. As a more skilled worker is likely to produce more output, and remember, how do we define productivity? It's output per unit time. And if this worker is less productive, how is that going to affect his wages? As this worker has a low level of skills, he's less productive. This means he has lower bargaining power, thus leading to lower wages. As a lower skill set means you're more easily replaced. There's lots of supply of low skilled workers, thus meaning you cannot demand as high wages as firms, instead of hiring you, will just hire 1 out of the 1,000. For example, McDonald's workers. If a McDonald's worker wants a higher wage, they will, instead of giving him a higher wage, they'll just hire 1 out of the 1,000 people in the line for the McDonald's job, since the level of skills are low, so it's easily replaced. And this, of course, leads to increased income inequality. Since the question specifically does ask us to reference both these figures, I'm going to have a quick look at figure 1. So this tells us the regional gross disposable household per capita, and it shows the north, of course, having lower levels, whereas the south having higher levels. So I'm just going to quote probably a figure from here. Now, this may seem overkill for an 8-mark question, especially just for one paragraph. But if you've done the work, if you've put in the time, you've mastered the content, this will just flow very easily, and you'll be able to write this in maybe 2 minutes. So the only thing that's going to take you a bit more time is finding the application. So 100%, you can write a bit less for this first paragraph, but I think this works. It's a very logical step-by-step chain of analysis. But yeah, let's move on to the second paragraph, which is on lack of infrastructure. And just before we move on to the second paragraph, with the valuation, I would just mention time lag. At the end of this extract, it mentions Mackenzie argues that improving education is crucial even if the returns are not immediately obvious. So I would use that, a bit of application, and then phrase that into the evaluation point, so the way I'd word it. However, in evaluation, this depends on the investment into education in the UK, in the north for example, depends on the time lag. As the extract states, the positive effects of investment into education will take time to become apparent in the economy. So even if the UK is investing now into education in the north in the short run, it will take time for its positive effects to be apparent in the economy. Okay, so for the second paragraph, with lack of infrastructure, of course, for the bit of application, I am probably going to use this. 28% of total public expenditure was spent in London, which is obviously quite a good start. And of course, earlier we did actually talk about the Gini coefficient value, which of course does represent the different levels of income inequality within a country. So that's also a great value to use. But how would I word this paragraph? So lack of infrastructure. So what does lack of infrastructure lead to, which causes income inequality? Of course, there's lots of things it leads to, but one of the main things it disincentivizes is business investment. As if you remember back to the globalization topic, one thing we say with FDI is when FDI comes in, for example, BT coming into India, what do they usually do? They improve the infrastructure, they improve the roads, the surrounding area for them to, of course, be able to operate in an efficient manner. But the reason why in the UK businesses do not invest into the north is due to the lack of infrastructure. So a great example I used to mention in my life classes is the north versus the south motorway links. So the south has much more links to motorways than the north. This leads to shorter transport times, and if there's shorter transport times, it leads to lower costs. Whereas in the north, you have less access to motorways, more access to air roads, which are slower, for example, lower speed limit, they have less connections to different parts of the country, thus, like I said before, higher transport times, higher logistical costs. So when a firm is looking to set up shop, when a firm is looking to get established somewhere, it is much more likely to set up shop somewhere in the south, somewhere along the M1 to M6 corridor, since if it needs to deliver goods, if it needs to transport anything, they can get straight onto the motorway. So there's much faster logistical, much faster transport time, and therefore much lower logistical costs. Whereas in the north, of course, it's going to take these firms longer to transport, increase costs, therefore disincentivizes these firms to invest. And if there's less firms investing into the north, of course, there's less jobs in the north, and of course meaning that it leads to income inequality. And that's pretty much how I would write up the entire point. I'm not going to read that entire thing out, well I might. So increased transport time, increased transport costs, firms are less likely to invest, less job creation, thus worsen income inequality. Now if your first evaluation point is what we mentioned, you don't even need a second evaluation point, but if you have good timekeeping, you have a bit more time, 100% you can write a second evaluation point here. I would say, however, in evaluation, the poor infrastructure in the north leading to worsened income inequality is dependent on technological change. As due to the UK's exports primarily service-based, a lot of this is available to do online, thus it stops the geographical immobility that the lack of infrastructure causes in the north. Thus meaning individuals living in the north can work remotely for firms in the south, thus reducing that level of income inequality. You see how in evaluation, improving infrastructure it may have an opportunity cost, may not be the most effective way to increase the levels or improve the levels of income inequality in the UK, as it may be better to improve schooling, as mentioned in the extract. But yeah, with the 8 mark question, of course, very simple, 2 marks evaluation. You really do not need much. And yeah, that is more than enough for the 8 mark question, and that would get you 8 out of 8. Moving on to the 10 mark question, let's have a shot at this. So with reference to figure 2, assess whether an increase in real incomes improves subjective happiness within the UK. So it's an assess question. So why do I agree? Why do I disagree? And firstly, let's just think about why we agree with this topic, why we agree with this statement. As when people have an increase in real incomes, I'm going to say there's also going to be an increase in disposable income. So if individuals, households have an increase in disposable income, this just means they have more income, they have more money left over after tax. And if they have more money after tax, it means they can afford to buy more goods and services, thus increasing the demand for goods and services. And for example, we're saying there's an increase in demand for goods and services, but for example, what type of goods and services could we get an increase in demand for? We could get an increase in demand for necessity goods. As for example, if the disposable income of low-income households rise, it means they can now afford to buy more necessities, for example, more rice, more bread, more food, for example, thus increasing the demand for necessities. And of course, if low-income households, if individuals and households can afford to buy more necessities, how is that going to affect them? That is, of course, going to improve like consumer happiness and more, and in a more holistic image, it's going to improve living standards. And that there is a solid KA paragraph, but of course, there are 2 marks for application, and we have not included any bits of application, and the question is specifically asking us to refer to figure 2, so let's have a look at that. Okay, so it's giving us a happiness rating, and what do we see here? The happiest individuals earn less than £10,000, which is closely followed by the individuals who earn more than £40,000, and the least happiest individuals are the ones who make £10,000 to £20,000. So a perfect bit of application you can include there when you're talking about low income households, you're talking about increased demand for necessities. You can say low income households, E.G, the individuals who earned 10,000 and less, when there is an increase in real incomes, it therefore means they can demand more goods and services. They can demand more necessity goods and services, thus meaning it improves their living standards. And we can see this by the happiness rating, with them receiving the highest happiness rating out of all income brackets, which I believe was 7.31. Yeah, so 7.31. So yeah, that's a really good point and a really good bit of application, where that would be enough to get you those 6 out of 6 marks there for that question. Since remember, 6 marks for your actual paragraph, and then there's 4 marks in your 10 mark question reserved for application. And now moving on to evaluation, how would I evaluate this 10 mark question? Now of course I think that there are quite a few easy evaluation points here, but I am also going to try use figure 2. But the first one that comes to my mind is of course like the concept of materialism. Of course we're just saying here that when people make more money they're happy, but of course you've probably heard of stories of people that win the lottery and very unhappy, or like rich people who are very unhappy. But yeah, so you could state the fact that just being able to afford more goods and services does not guarantee happiness. Also, let's just break down the figure itself. So let's just think about using our brains. It's talking about subjective happiness. So firstly, the first thing we can say is very subjective. But if I asked you how happy you are right now, you could be the same level of happiness as someone else, another individual, but still give totally different ratings. So of course, happiness is very subjective, and it's not something you can easily measure. So you can definitely talk about the limitation of this study itself, since happiness is a very hard thing to measure, as you guys probably know. Thus, it's very hard to give it a rating which is accurate. So the word that evaluation point is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the validity of this survey, of this study, as it is actually quite hard to measure in a quantitative way how happy an individual is. Thus, it means the survey is probably not, and it's not as representative or as accurate as the data shows. And another great evaluation point which directly contradicts what we're saying in our chain of analysis. So we've said when individuals have more disposable income, more real income, it means that they're going to be happier since they have an improved living standard. So they can demand more goods and services, and by demanding more goods and services, their living standards are going to improve. However, the data itself completely contradicts this. Why? Since individuals who make the least amount of money are the happiest, and as we make more money, well, we start off with a massive decrease as the income increases, and then as we make more money, happiness incrementally increases, but never gets to the same point. The way I would word that is saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on how increasing incomes actually decreases subjective happiness as shown in the figure. Quote the figure, maybe quote less than 10,000 and then 10,000 to 20,000 just to show that, pick up the application marks, and then go on to explain what we just mentioned. And yeah, that is of course more than enough evaluation. Here, since there's only 4 marks for evaluation, you can get away with 1 well-developed evaluation point, or if you have the time or you just want to make sure you secure the marks, just throw in 2, and that is more than enough to get 10 out of 10 on your 10-mark question. Moving on to the 12-mark question, let's get started with this. So with reference to extract C and your own knowledge, discuss methods the UK government could use to increase tax revenue. Okay, so first things first, the first thing that comes to my mind is we're talking about tax revenue, we're talking about increasing tax revenue. The first literal thing that comes to mind is the Laffer curve. Now, this is genuinely one of the best evaluation points, definitely up there as an A-star evaluation point, and especially if you know some application to back it up. I think I might have taught it once before in one of the past papers, but if you know how to apply that to the real world, if you know how to apply the Laffer curve to the UK, you can really pick up some top marks. So let's get that drawn out. Even though that would just be an evaluation point in this paragraph, it is still an absolute killer diagram. So of course, what is on the axis? On our x-axis, we have tax rate, and on our y-axis, we have tax revenue. When I'm marking papers, this is the main time, or marking essays, this is the main mistake I see with the Laffer curve. You need to remember, on both axes is tax, but on your x-axis is the tax rate, and on your y-axis is the tax revenue. And of course, just looks like a, I don't know, like an upside down U. But of course, the main thing that the Laffer curve does show that an increase in tax rate past the optimum will actually lead to a decrease in tax revenue. And of course, when we're increasing tax rate, we want to increase tax revenue, and this shows the opposite can happen. So it shows it acts as a really good evaluation point. But anyway, let's get back on to the question. So with reference to extract C, discuss methods the UK government could use to increase tax revenue. So very simply, as this diagram would show as well, if we want to increase tax revenue, what do we need to do? We need to increase the tax rate. So that is going to be probably what I base both my paragraphs off, increasing tax rate. So what type of taxes could we increase? So things like corporation tax, income tax, even things like, I think a really good paragraph would also be VAT, so increasing value added tax. So now you could literally get away with just doing these, and that would, you could 100% get 12 out of 12 marks for just this. So just picking two of these 3, so maybe corporation tax and VAT, and just talking about how we increase them, develop the chain of analysis, how that will lead to an increase in tax revenue. But also, since we have both of these on here together, what does this show? So I'm going to label 3 points. So blue point, purple point, and red point. So also, what's another method we can get an increase in tax revenue by? So one method is, of course, like we've just mentioned here, an increase in tax rate. Where can we see that? We can see that from the red to the yellow point. As when we increase tax rate, we get an increase in tax revenue from red to purple. But now, what is another method we can use to increase tax revenue? And that is from blue to purple. What we can do is actually decrease the tax rate, and as we can see, tax revenue increases from here to now here. So we get a massive increase in tax revenue. So there's actually 2 methods we can use to increase tax revenue. So if you wanted to, for one paragraph, you could talk about an increase in tax rate, and for a second paragraph, you could talk about a decrease in tax rate and how that would increase then the quantity of tax revenue. But also, since this question, of course, we need the evaluation marks, it's asking us to give reference to extract C. So let's have a quick peek over extract C. So what is extract C talking about? Is options for UK tax rises in the future. Okay, so it lists 3 different types of options for raising additional tax revenue. So very related to the question, and I think this will provide lots of applications. So this should be all the application marks secure. So we can increase council tax on houses, we can give a one-off wealth tax, we can increase corporation tax. So that pretty much secures my thinking now, my plan. I'm 100% going to do a paragraph on increasing corporation tax. Why? Since, of course, there's going to be lots of application in this little section. As you can see, UK's corp tax increased to 25%, still the lowest rate in the G7, but it will raise tax revenue 17.2 billion in 2025-2026. Another good figure about the G7, the UK has the second worst productivity in the G7 after the 2008 financial crisis. The only country behind us is Japan, and the reason why Japan is so unproductive is because their population is very, very aging, very, very old, not aging. and that's one of the biggest contributing factors to our current account deficit and a persistent current account deficit. But that is another topic, so we will not go any more in depth with that. But yeah, let's get started with this 12-mark question. So this paragraph isn't going to be the most developed chain of analysis, since there's not really much to speak about here, and that is the reason why I really wanted to include VAT, since VAT has quite much, you can add quite a lot more depth to VAT than you can add for corporation tax. But how would I word the paragraph on corporation tax? So one method the UK government could use to increase tax revenue is increase the rate of corporation tax. E.g, the UK government in 2023 increased the top rate of UK corporation tax from 19% it was to 25%, and then I'll just let you quote this figure. We still have the lowest rate in the G7, but it will raise 17.2 billion in 2025 to 2026. And then with my chain of analysis, I would just say corporation tax is a tax on a firm's profits. If the rate of corporation tax increases, it means firms will pay a larger percentage of their profits in taxes, thus leading to an increase in tax revenue. And that is literally the whole chain of analysis, and that is why you can understand why a lot of students pick the decrease in tax rate paragraphs instead, since it's a lot easier to develop a longer, just a lot more chains of analysis paragraph. So decreasing corporation tax, the main thing it's going to do is incentivize FDI, incentivize foreign firms. Why? Since if foreign firms are now looking into the UK, are looking to invest into the UK is a more lucrative thing to invest into. Why? Since when they invest into the UK, since the rates of corporation tax are lower, it means they will make more profit, since less of their profit is being taken away in tax. And if more firms are investing into the UK, yes, we have a decrease in our tax rate, but if there's more firms in the UK, the quantity of firms will mean that we're actually making more tax revenue. So you could say by decreasing the tax rate, we're going to get an increase in corporation tax revenue. But that's not where the chain of analysis ends here. You can then talk about how does FDI also affect a country. It's going to lead to improvements in infrastructure, since they invest into the infrastructure. And then things like, when a foreign firm invests into the UK, they have to hire UK workers. They have to hire domestic workers. Thus, if they're hiring domestic workers, it's going to lead to more workers being paid, increase in disposable income, thus meaning the government will receive also an increase in tax revenue. It means the government will also receive an increase in income tax revenue. So meaning we have an increase in corporation tax and an increase in income tax. So now going even further with that, if these individuals now have a disposable income, they have money, they can spend it, it's going to lead to an increase in another tax revenue, which is VAT. Since why? They're spending on more goods and services, and of course, VAT is a flat rate, it's 20% on each good and service, and since we're buying more goods and services, since we have more money, it means there's also going to be an increase in VAT tax revenue. So by the government decreasing corporation tax, you can link in all those different types of taxes and develop a really substantiated chain of analysis. So of course, this is why planning is so important, since you can write the exact same paragraph on increased corporation tax and not pick up many marks for your chain of analysis. We could do the same paragraph for decreasing tax rates, and there's so much more chain of analysis. There's so many better links that 100% I believe you should there do the decrease in tax revenue paragraph. But we'll go through evaluations for them both just to make sure whatever paragraph you did, we'll cover the evaluations for it. So firstly, increase in tax revenue. Of course, we're going to use the Laffer curve to evaluate. What would I say and how would I word it? I'd say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the UK's position on its Laffer curve. As if the UK is at the purple position, whatever you want to label it, if you want to do it in the exam, I'd probably just label it like A or like B, C, whatever you want to label it. But in this scenario, it's the purple point. So the way I would word it is, however, in evaluation, an increase in corporation tax, increase in the government's tax revenue depends on the UK's position on its Laffer curve. As if the UK is originally at position purple, X, or whatever you want to call it, an increase in tax rate is actually going to move us towards this point, and it's going to therefore lead to a decrease in tax revenue. Thus, increase in tax rates too far will actually do the opposite effect and decrease tax revenue. As you can talk about why these unintended effects are happening, since if they increase corporation tax too far, it leads to disincentivizing firms, as the firms are thinking too much of our profits are being taken away, let's just either stop producing or move to another country, thus meaning that there's actually going to be a decrease in tax revenue since these firms may move out, etc, etc. Another great evaluation point, and a really specific one to corporation tax, is saying, however, in evaluation, an increase in the tax revenue depends on corporation tax being tiered. So essentially, there's different tiers of corporation tax. So even though the headline figure is saying that corporation tax in the UK has increased to 25%, that is not entirely true. So essentially, before 2023, I think it was August 2023, the UK's corporation tax was 19%, and it was 19% for all firms. But in 2023, what they did, they increased corporation tax, the highest band of corporation tax, to 25%. But what that actually means, there's now two tiers of corporation tax. So firms making under £50,000 of profit, they still pay the 19%. Whereas firms making over £50,000 worth of profit, they pay 25%. So the way you could word this evaluation point, as I've written here, however, in evaluation, an increase in tax revenue depends on corporation tax being tiered. As now, it depends on the distribution and the portfolio of our firms in the UK. As for example, if pretty much all our firms in the UK are small firms making less than £50,000 worth of profit, this will mean, even though we've increased the highest band of income tax, of corporation tax, so the top band has increased, if most of the firms are small firms, they're receiving the same rate of corporation tax, thus meaning we're going to see no significant increase in the rates of corporation tax. So essentially, I've written out that evaluation point, but corporation tax actually increasing tax revenue depends on the demographic of UK firms. And just for the sake of this question, just for the sake of this evaluation point, we're saying that if all firms in the UK are small firms, even if we increase that top rate, we're actually going to see no increase in tax revenue. That is the evaluation box. So I've given you 2 points there for an increase in tax rate. Let's move on to the opposite side, which is a decrease in tax rate, and more specifically, a decrease in corporation tax. How would I evaluate this? And this is a classic mistake students make. Students will always use the Laffer curve for an increase in tax rate. However, they forget you can also use the Laffer curve to evaluate a decrease in tax rate. And how can we show that? So it's just using different points now. So of course we're saying a decrease in tax rate is going to lead, so a decrease in corporation tax rate is going to lead to an increase in tax revenue due to several effects. But Laffer curve can evaluate that, can show a limitation of that. As for example, if we decrease tax rate from the purple to the red point, what is going to happen to tax revenue? Tax revenue decreases from T1, we can say, to now T2. So by actually decreasing tax rate, as we would expect, we get a decrease in tax revenue. And again, you can just word it the exact same way. However, in evaluation, this depends on the UK's position on its Laffer curve, as if the UK is at point X and it decreases its tax rate, it will actually lead to a fall in the tax revenue as it moves towards position Y, the red circle, whatever you want to call it. Also, even more specifically, so we talked about the main chain of analysis was based on the assumption that a decrease in corporation tax is going to lead to an increase in FDI. But that's a great point to therefore evaluate. You say, however, in evaluation, this depends on whether a decrease in corporation tax will lead to an increase in FDI. As we know, there's several factors which contribute to firms moving into a country. As for example, one massive factor could be wage costs. As even though there's lower corporation tax, the UK has very high wage costs and high non-wage costs. So for example, we have really high working conditions. For example, like even builders cannot step on the top legally, cannot step on the top step of a ladder, as is against working regulations. And then we have a very high minimum wage. So those factors could, even though we have a decrease in tax revenue, could stop new firms entering the UK, thus meaning all the positive effects we mentioned of an increase in FDI will not happen, thus obviously limiting and working as a really good evaluation point. And this goes back to the simple tips I give in my evaluation video. It's the biggest video on my channel, you can probably find it quite easily, but I just state that to evaluate, you need to read through your chain of analysis and just look for any assumptions you've made, as those assumptions act as really good specific evaluation points. As if you can question the assumption, you question the entire rest of the chain of analysis, and that's all economics literally is. You constantly, in evaluation, question the assumption, and it works as a really good evaluation point. And that is enough to get you 12 out of 12 marks on that question. Moving on to the 15-mark question. So, with reference to extract B, discuss the benefits of an increase in infrastructure spending on the UK economy, using an AD and an AS diagram to support your answer. Now, so far, this is my 5th past paper. So I've done both 2017, done both 2023, and so this is my 6th paper, then done 2022 paper 1 and 2022, and this is paper 2. And already, so technically I've only done 3 macro papers, and already this question has pretty much, I can remember it like pretty much off the back of my hand, and this is exactly what I try to emphasise to students all the time. The same questions year on year repeat. The spec is only a certain size, they can only assess you on a certain amount of topics, thus getting through all these past papers is an absolutely compulsory thing, especially if you're aiming for the A stars, as you should be. Quite literally, if you're thinking about June 2017, 15 mark question, the one I've covered on my channel, should be somewhere. It is another question on supply side policy and pretty much exactly the same as this. Then June 2023, the 12 mark question, also a very supply side policy related question, and it's all using that same chain of analysis. And this is again why I try to emphasize so much to students. Make sure, and one of the biggest priorities after you have content mastery is mastering your exam technique, and one way you do that is by trying to go through as many past papers as possible. Okay, so back to the question, and of course the question does refer to we need to use extract B. So let's have a quick scan of extract B and let's see what extract B is mentioning. So it's public sector spending on infrastructure. So it looks like it's going to have a few good stats and figures, and particularly the last paragraph where it's talking about new developments, new train lines being built, for example, Blythe, Haxby in Yorkshire. And yeah, so some really good stats here to pick up those application marks for your 25 mark question, 15 mark question, sorry. Okay, but what's the first thing that comes to my mind when I'm thinking about this question? It's an increase in infrastructure spending. The first thing that comes to my mind, it reduces costs for firms. And why is that? We can use some application from the extract we just looked at. So for example, the reopening train lines of Blythe. Well, how is that going to affect firms? It means maybe transport times for firms are going to be faster. Maybe even the costs for transport would be lower. So instead of using a truck, they can now transport their goods on a train. So transport times are faster. It means, for example, for the worker maybe supervising that cargo, supervising that package, they have to pay him for less hours since the transport's faster, thus meaning the cost for firms will decrease. So I'd explain that in my chain of analysis and embed that example, embed the Blythe and maybe some stats and figures from that into my chain of analysis. And if a firm's costs fall, of course, how do we show that on a diagram? As I always do, you would show that on a SRS diagram. So how would a decrease in costs affect a firm's SRAS curve? It would of course cause the SRAS to shift out to SRAS1, indicating cheaper costs. And this would of course lead to a decrease in price level from PLE to now PL1, and more importantly, an increase in real GDP from YE to Y1. And it doesn't just stop there. These lower costs will incentivize new firms to invest, or incentivize firms to invest. As let's actually think about it, there's lower costs, which also means for these firms, there's now higher profits, which is going to incentivize new firms, or like I said, existing firms to invest. When a firm invests, they're usually trying to expand. And when they're investing, they might build something like a new factory. And when they build a new factory, they're going to need to build links to that factory, for example, for trucks to come in. Thus, what they're going to build, they're going to improve the roads nearby. And all that, again, what's happening now is improving the infrastructure. And now these positive effects are further compounding, thus leading to even better and even more growth of our AD and our LRAS. Since, of course, the economy's productive capacity is again increasing. And as we can see, this investment is going to lead to LRS shifting out to LRS1, like we said, increasing the productive capacity of the economy, potential growth, as some people may want to put it. And of course, AD is shifting out to AD1 due to, of course, an increase in investment. Of course, investment being a component of AD, showing, as some people would say, actual growth again. And real GDP increases from YE to Y1, having several positive effects on the economy. So that's how I would word the first paragraph. So start from talking about improvements in infrastructure lead to lower costs for firms. This would of course cause SRS to shift out, and when SRS shifts out, it means that firms have lower costs. And with firms having lower costs, of course, that means that it could lead to increased profits for firms. This will therefore incentivize other firms, new firms, existing firms to invest, and more investment is of course going to further increase the productive capacity of the economy, increase AD, increase real GDP, which is several benefits, several positive effects on the economy. Moving on to section C, and of course we have our two 25 mark questions. And just before we get started with 7 and then later on 8, let's have a look at this. So they are, so first one, number 7 is on protectionism, and the number 8 is on globalization. So both the 25 mark questions on the topic of globalization. Now, why am I bringing this up? Since a lot of students do not like the topic of globalization, they under-revise it, and in this scenario, if you maybe have neglected globalization slightly, you are totally screwed. So globalization, I really believe, is a really easy topic to score well on 25 mark questions on, especially if you practice them, you know how to answer the questions. So 100%, I would say globalization has almost as much weighting as your entirety of your government objectives. So all the inflation, all that big topic of inflation, all the rest of the government objectives, all the policies, people really tend to focus on them, but then neglect the other side of the spec, which is the global economy. So the main topic being globalization is 100%. As we can see from exam papers, and this is the reason why we do past papers, to try find the relative weighting, try find what actually comes up in the exam, to revise things that actually come up in the exam instead of just revising from your content. So there's a difference between revising from the exam papers and revising content. So revising content, you're just making sure you can recall things, whereas you have no idea whether that's actually highly weighted, whether that comes up in the exam. And there's some topics which come up a lot, there's some topics do not come up a lot. So by doing exam papers, you're making sure you're actively revising the topics, the questions that are regularly assessed. And that is, of course, why we promote doing exam questions so much. Let's get started with the first 25 mark question. So evaluate the likely impact of an increase in protectionism on the global economy. Now, it is currently 2025, 17th of August when I'm recording this. And of course, in last few months, this is actually, of course, very topical with Donald Trump's tariffs and all of the trade barriers we are seeing recently. You could talk about the concept of deglobalization. And yeah, so of course, the question is on an increase in protectionism, and it gives us, again, a stimulus which is very relevant right now as well, on China and US tariff barriers. And the stimulus just talks about the China and US, which of course is very relevant in the current moment as well, but their tariff barriers. And the IMF estimates it's going to reduce global GDP growth by 0.8. And when I read that, the first thing I'm thinking about is a theory of comparative advantage. As remember, the main thing the theory of comparative advantage states is that if countries specialize in a good they have a comparative advantage in, it means global output will increase, and if global output increases, what does that mean? It means global GDP increases. Thus, of course, if global GDP is increasing, it means living standards are improving in every single country. So, since this is an impact question, the way I'm going to think about it is which are the different shareholders in the economy it can impact. So let's think firstly, who are the different shareholders in the economy? So we'll start with, so of course, consumers are the first shareholder, then we have firms, then we have households, we have governments, etc., etc. But what I'm going to focus this question on this answer on, is the two big ones, which are consumers and firms. So how is an increase in protectionism going to affect consumers and firms? And how would we show this increase in protectionism on a diagram? And of course, that would be a simple, nice tariff diagram. So of course, price on your y-axis, quantity on your x-axis, then supply. And what is supply? Supply is domestic supply, so supply by the producers within that country. And then demand is exactly the same, demand, and of course demand is domestic, so the demand by the consumers within that country. Then of course we would add world supply. And since we're talking about trade barriers, since we're talking about an increase in protectionism, I'm going to add quite a big tariff here just to represent how it is going to affect the economy. So world supply plus tariff. And then also, what else? The other thing I am actually going to label up is this point here. So what does the equilibrium point represent? This is where demand by domestic consumers is met perfectly, is at equilibrium with supply by domestic producers. So what does this mean? This means there is no need for any trade to occur since the demand is satisfied by the supply. Thus, if there's no trade, you can also call this a closed economy, somewhere like North Korea, for example. Okay, so let's get started with the first paragraph, which I'm going to do, of course, on consumers. So my key point for my paragraph is going to be one likely impact of an increase in protectionism on the global economy will be lower living standards for domestic consumers. And I'd use the example of the tariff that Donald Trump set this year in March 2025, where he imposed a 25% tariff on the import of steel. So then I would start my chain of analysis by explaining what protectionism actually is. Since remember, we assume the examiner has no content knowledge and we're being as step-by-step as possible. So what is protectionism? It's where a government tries to protect its domestic economy, and for example, in the example of the US, why has Donald Trump set a 25% tax on aluminium, steel and all them imports? Since Donald Trump is trying to protect its domestic economy, is trying to protect its domestic, the US steel and aluminium firms. The way it gets started with a chain of analysis is just by explaining what protectionism policies and what protectionism actually is. Since remember, we're always assuming to have the most step-by-step chains of analysis, we assume the examiner has no content knowledge, so we develop that step-by-step chain. So I'd actually use that applied example. So I would explain protectionism, which is where governments they attempt to protect domestic industries, and the way they do that is by imposing trade barriers such as tariffs, quotas, any other things on foreign countries and opposing countries. And this is the exact reason why Donald Trump set his 25% steel and aluminium tariffs, and like the things on car imports, car engines, the 25% tariff on those as well. Why? Since Donald Trump is trying to protect its domestic, the US and trying to protect the US car industry's employment levels. Since of course, if US car firms are doing well, if they're making profits, and if they're selling goods, the derived demand for labour, the demand for US employment will stay high. And of course, that is of course one of every single country's big macro objectives, to maintain high levels of employment. So then I would go on to explain how protectionism actually affects consumers. So these tariff barriers, what they're going to do for consumers, and of course we can show that on the diagram. When world supply increases from WS to WST, what does this mean? It means prices are increasing for domestic consumers. And why is that? That is of course due to the quantity of imports is decreasing from Q1 to now Q2, Q3. And what does this mean? It means that domestic firms now face less competition by these foreign firms, and with less competition it can drive up prices. And then also the opposite side of the spectrum, where the quantity of imports has decreased from Q1 to Q4 to now Q2 to Q3. What does this mean? It means the quantity of imports has now decreased, and if the quantity of imports now decreased, we can say consumers have less choice also. So consumers are getting a really bad bargain, aren't they? They're getting higher prices and also less choice. And of course, the combination of these two are going to lead to reduction in consumer welfare and reduction, more importantly, in consumer living standards. Since why? Let's go back to the theory of comparative advantage. So, one of the assumptions we make with comparative advantage is that there's no trade barriers. And of course, with protectionism, that distorts. That means the theory of comparative advantage is no longer valid. And what do we say the theory of comparative advantage states? It states that if countries specialise in goods they have a comparative advantage in, it means global output will increase, which means global real GDP will increase, which means global living standards improve. Whereas, as you can see, due to us distorting, we're no longer fitting the assumptions of comparative advantage. It means at the end, so it shows that global GDP, well, these countries' GDP is now decreasing since they're not trading, and therefore the countries' living standards are now decreasing. And that is, of course, backed up by the extract, the stimulus, where it mentions that it will reduce global GDP growth by 0.8%. And if you want to explain living standards in a bit more depth, you can mention higher prices. Why? Since with higher prices, it means consumers can no longer afford to demand the goods they want and need, for example, necessities. And therefore, for example, if they can't buy medication, if they can't buy essentials like food, or even things, luxury goods that they want, this is what we would also call a decrease in living standard. But essentially, that's how I would use my first paragraph. Make sure and remember, use your diagram as much as possible, embed it into your chains of analysis as much as possible, and remember always being step by step with the chain of analysis. But now let's move on to evaluation. Okay, so a great evaluation point here is talking about time frame. So talking about how the effects may differ between the short run versus the long run. As of course, in the short run, we're having these negative effects that consumers are suffering from higher prices and less choice. But you could contrast that by saying, however, in evaluation, this depends on the positive effects in the long run. As in the long run, of course, what are the point of these protectionist policies? They are to protect domestic industries, to protect infant industries, and by the government pursuing these protectionist policies, they could be successful in protecting these industries and protecting domestic employment, which of course is a much bigger positive, and which is of course a much more important part of the economy rather than consumers just receiving slightly higher prices. Also, you could mention these domestic firms could adapt, as in the long run, as they're serving more customers, they're producing more output, they could achieve things like economies of scale, exploit those economies of scale, therefore have lower costs. And if they have lower costs, this means they can charge consumers now lower prices. So that's a double positive for the government. It means we are no longer importing, therefore you can think about things like the current account is improving, and then also domestic industries are getting stronger. Thus meaning, like I said, it's a positive, it's a double whammy positive. Okay, and now moving on to the second paragraph, which is of course going to be on firms. So how is an increase in protectionism going to affect firms? Let's have a think about this. And I'm going to use the UK example here. And how does UK relate to protectionism? So the UK stance on protectionism is we champion free trade. So UK firms are net importers of raw materials. Since of course, if you think back to globalization and protectionism itself, one of the main disadvantages of globalization occurring is that countries have now become less diversified. For example, let's talk about Saudi Arabia. 50% of Saudi Arabia's GDP is dependent on oil, and it's in the oil industry. Thus, of course, if, with example, oil is a non-renewable resource, so when oil runs out, it means suddenly 50% of Saudi's real GDP disappears. And it's similar with the UK. Of course, Margaret Thatcher, she closed down the mines, she closed down lots of sectors like that. Why? Because she knew that we could import coal for cheaper. But now what does that lead to? It means that now we do not make any coal, we don't dig for coal ourselves. Thus meaning that if these protectionism policies happen, if these trade barriers are imposed, we are still forced to import these natural resources, meaning that we have to pay the higher prices. So therefore we're dependent on other economies and we're reliant on other economies. Therefore that's why one of the main negatives of globalization, as before globalization, countries were mostly self-sufficient. But now, with of course how the theory of comparative advantage goes, with countries having to specialise, or they should specialise in that one good which have a comparative advantage in, and dedicate as many factors of production to that one country, to that one good or that one service. Since essentially what comparative advantage is trying to do is trying to make every single country a hub, a factory for one specialised good, and therefore we have hundreds of countries which all provide one really specialised good or service, which means when we all trade, it of course leads to better trading, better allocation of resources. But of course, due to the dynamicness of the global economy and due to like tensions between the global economy, it can lead to that being distorted. But anyway, UK firms are net importers of raw material. As like I said, the UK is not self-sufficient. So if the UK sets trade barriers such as a tariff to protect domestic employment, this is of course a trade barrier is going to mark retaliation. So wherever we set a trade barrier on, whichever country we set it on, they will retaliate, usually with a similar tariff, a similar trade barrier. So now, if this opposing country or this country we've set this trade barrier on retaliate, how is that going to affect the cost of our imports? Of course, that is now going to lead to an increased cost of import. Why? Since a tariff is a tax on imports, so now that whatever percentage that tariff is, we're going to have to add that onto the cost of the good. And of course, how do we show an increase in the cost of raw materials for firms? We of course would show this on a SRAS diagram. And what would it look like? So of course, SRAS would shift inwards, so leftward, to SRAS1. Now what are the effects of this, and what do we call this? So of course price level is going to increase from PLE to PL1. And what type of inflation is this? This is of course cost push inflation. And of course coupled with the cost push inflation, we also have a reduction in real GDP. So overall, the effect on firms is if the UK firm set a tariff and of course use a tariff diagram, incorporate the diagram as much as possible, opposing countries would retaliate, thus increasing the cost of imports, which shifts SRAS to SRS1, which of course is cost push inflation, and it will lead to cost push inflationary pressures on the UK economy. And of course, you shouldn't underestimate the real GDP effects, as of course the real GDP is decreasing from YE to Y1, thus also meaning by setting a tariff they're getting negative economic growth, which of course goes against the macroeconomic target of economic growth. And of course, you can link that to many things. You could say this leads to lower living standards. You could say it decreases the level of employment in the UK since there's less goods and services being produced. If there's less goods and services being produced, of course, we need less workers to produce these goods and services, thus decreasing the derived demand for labour. And of course, that would completely go against the intended effect of the UK. So one of the main reasons the UK would set a tariff is to protect their domestic employment, whereas as in reality, and as we've proved in the chain of analysis, it could actually decrease the levels of employment. Okay, so moving on to valuation, of course, there are several different valuation points you can talk about here. One of them is a bit of a niche. Of course, you can talk about the simple ones, or well, not very simple, but the classic ones we spoke about several times, which are size of tariff. Of course, that works quite well. But then also, you can talk about how it affects different sectors differently, since of course we said the UK are net importer of raw materials, but some UK firms will of course be able to get their raw materials from inside the UK, whereas some firms such as pharmaceuticals will not be able to get all their raw materials inside the UK. So some firms that use like rare materials, or like material like diamonds, stuff like that. I don't think there's many diamonds in the UK, therefore they're going to be affected the worst. So like I always say, the way to evaluate is to read through your chain of analysis and find any assumptions. First assumption we made is that a country will retaliate. Even before that, we've assumed that UK is going to set a tariff barrier. What did I tell you at the start of this? UK champions free trade, so it's very unlikely they will set a tariff barrier. So that is one evaluation. But then also, opposing countries retaliate. There's no guarantee that the opposing country will retaliate and there will be a trade war. So you could kind of link that in with the size of the tariff. So you could say, however, in evaluation, this depends on the size of the tariff. As if the tariff is relatively small, it is unlikely that the country will start a full-blown trade war, will retaliate with the UK due to this size of the tariff. And then let's move to the next chain. So increased cost of imports. You could say, however, this depends on the time frame, as the UK firms could move away from importing from these countries, which the UK has a trade war, has tariffs imposed on the UK, and they could move to different countries who maybe don't have a trade war, who aren't in a trade war with the UK, thus have no tariffs. And then, of course, again, like I said, this is why we go through the chain of analysis. We see the assumptions we made. Also, when we talk about the SRS shifting to SRAS1, it depends on the degree to which how much SRAS shifts. As SRS shifts this much, it doesn't have much effect on the UK economy. There'll only be a small degree of cost push inflation, thus minimising the negative effects, such as the negative effects on living standards and the negative effects on employment. And of course, you could also say, however, this depends on whether the positive versus the negatives. So it depends on whether the cost plus inflationary pressures are worth that the UK domestic firms, the domestic infant industries, are now growing. So it might be better to survive, basically take those cost push inflationary pressures, but then now it means that our domestic industries are growing. So almost opportunity cost. It is worth the opportunity cost of cost push inflationary pressures to allow our domestic industries to grow. But yeah, that is how I would answer that 25-mark question. Just giving you a few points there. But yeah, that is the end of the numbers. Moving on to the second 25-mark question. Let's get right on with it. Evaluate the likely impact, it's an impact question, of globalization on the global economy. So the impacts of globalization on the global economy. Let's have a quick read of the stimulus. So global economic growth is slowing and inequality is rising. So it's giving us some of the impacts already in the stimulus. So then it talks about the benefits of globalization with increased global trade, international trade agreements. Yep, so allowing countries, so what does it say here? Allowing countries to focus on their strengths. What does that remind you of? Of course, comparative advantage, since countries with globalization are now able to specialize in the goods they have a comparative advantage in, since before globalization that wasn't possible, since they couldn't dedicate too many factors of production in the economy to the goods they had the comparative advantage in, as they had to produce everything. Since before globalization, economies had to be self-sufficient, whereas after globalization, due to trade, it meant that instead of having to produce everything, they can just produce the good they're really good at, the good they have a comparative advantage in, and then trade for the rest of the goods, which of course is massively efficient. And of course, this is probably going to be one of our big paragraph points. But yeah, so it allows them to focus on their strengths, as well as reducing risks. through diversification. But yeah, let's start planning a few points for and against. So firstly, my biggest point, and the 4th point, is of course going to be what actually is globalization. It's increased integration of global economies. But what is the biggest impact? Of course, and to put it as simply as possible, is increased trade. But increased trade isn't an impact. So if I was talking about the specific impact this had, I would say it led to, so globalization, the end goal and the end effect of globalization, the significant effect, was improvements in living standards. And you'll see this a lot. This topic of globalization development, theme 4, we relate it a hell of a lot to living standards, since of course, if you think about it on a human perspective, that is one of the biggest things that matters. And if you want to think about more impacts here, you can just simply think about the different shareholders in the economy. How does it affect consumers? How does it affect firms? How does it affect governments? So with more globalization, of course, what you could write for governments, it has been quite positive. Why? Since of course this stimulus is of course talking about deglobalization and trade barriers slightly, but through globalization, it's allowed countries to now also set trade barriers, which means that for governments, you can say a positive effect has been, there's been an increase in tax revenue. And then for consumers, of course, what some positive effects of globalization, it means that they have more choice, lower prices. For firms, of course, they can sell to now global markets, thus really exploit their economies of scale. For workers, it's allowed more international opportunities, since again this goes back to what some of the causes of globalization, that was improvements in transport. And then for smaller points, you can even talk about things like the environment. With the globalization now occurring, with increased integration between different economies, between every single economy in the globe, it has meant that instead of neglecting the climate change fight, it's now meant that we are coming more together, and there's more regulation to fight and to try to promote against global warming. A great example of that, I actually learned this from a student who was very passionate about global warming. It's the Paris Agreement. I believe it was in 2015. It's essentially where lots of countries came together to agree to reduce carbon emissions. But yeah, you can use any of those points and they all work. And the way I would decide to pick which one, it just depends on which you feel the most comfortable with writing the longest chain of analysis. So even if you prefer one point rather than the other, if you believe you can write, for the one that you don't prefer, you can write a longer chain of analysis, that is the one I would pick, since of course one of the main things that determines your mark is just your length of chain of analysis. Of course, it needs to be step by step, it needs to be in depth, but you need to have enough quantity for the examiner to give you those top marks, that top band. But if I was doing this 25 marker, I would probably, I'd do 1.4, 1 point against, and the biggest point for disproportionately is increased trade. So now let's move on to the against point. So what would I write against? And this is very simple to me, since again I think this is the biggest point and one of the biggest impacts of globalization, which is there's lots of different words for it, but globalization has led to a lack of diversification for economies. So you can call it a lack of diversification, over reliance on imports, several different things. A great example of where we saw this recently is the Russia-Ukraine war, where about 40% of Europe's import of gas was from Russia, and of course Russia cut its supply of gas to Europe. And in the UK, the headline figure is, following the first year of the invasion, we saw average household gas prices rise around £800 per household. So every single household in the UK's gas prices went up on average by £800, which of course we were also in the cost of living crisis at the time, and it just amplified that cost of living crisis even further. I just want to add a bit on here. This isn't related to this question, but it's really just absolute A-star knowledge. So here I've mentioned about gas prices and the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, if you have watched the June 2023 paper 2, in one of the 25 mark questions, I go into a lot of depth about COVID and the COVID timeline, and basically how the inflation rates, how they differed between COVID and what caused these inflation rates. And one of the main things I mentioned, and one of the headline figures, is during 2022 to 2023, the UK suffered with 8 months of consecutive double-digit inflation. Now, one of the main causes of these 8 consecutive months of double-digit inflation was the Russia-Ukraine war. The gas we were now importing was very expensive. Of course, how is that going to affect firms? It's going to lead to cost-push inflation. So that inflation is a supply-side problem. So there was a supply-side problem since the gas we were importing was very expensive, thus causing inflation in our economy. So how did the government respond to these consecutive months of high inflation? the government can only respond using demand-side policies. So they use contractionary demand-side policies such as monetary and fiscal. So with monetary, in August 2023, interest rates hit the highest they've hit since 2008, since the financial crisis, which is 5.25%. But the reason why this was not dragging down inflation and we still had high sustained levels of inflation was that the demand side policies can only solve the demand side of the economy. They cannot solve the supply side of the economy. So the inflation was coming from the high price of these gas imports, but the government was responding using demand side policies. So it is very in depth and it is very high level at this point, but it works as a really good evaluation point if you're talking about COVID and if the questions are related to it. That, however, it depends on how the government addresses the inflation, as it depends where the inflation is coming from. As if inflation, as we saw in the Russia-Ukraine war, is from it's a supply side problem. If it's coming from the supply side of the economy, us responding using demand side policies on the like contractionary fiscal, contractionary monetary policy will not actually solve the root cause of the inflation, thus be ineffective, and you can actually relate that to, if you wanted to, is an example of government failure. Anyway, back onto the question. There will be some seekers, there will be some A-star students who really want to secure that A-star, and I know if I was a student, I would love these little tips, these little golden nuggets that occasionally, if you watch all the videos, I do mention a few of them. But yeah, I hope that helped a few of you out there. But anyway, back to the question. Also, another great example of this overdependence, this lack of diversification, is of course Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the total GDP of Saudi Arabia, is 40 to 50% is reliant on oil. 80% of the government revenue comes from oil, thus meaning that, of course, with oil not being a renewable resource, like I mentioned in the last 25 mark question, it means that if oil, since it's not a renewable resource, when it runs out, that is going to have a massive effect on the economy. And of course, Saudi have responded to this. You could use this as an evaluation point for this paragraph. You might have heard of Saudi Vision 2030, where they're trying to promote things like tourism, essentially trying to diversify their economy. But yeah, anyway, let's go on with the first point, the 4 point, and let's demonstrate my chain of analysis. So my K point, my topic question, again, what do? You reuse as many words from the question as possible. One likely impact of globalization on the global economy is an improvement in living standards. That's it. That's all I would say. No shade of analysis needed. I'd write, for example, and essentially what I would say is China, before 2001, they were heavily state-controlled. They were essentially a closed economy. They didn't used to trade with anyone. But then after 2001, they joined the World Trade Organization and, of course, began trading. And the way I'd write it, I'd write, for example, China in 2001 joined the World Trade Organization and began trading. It caused trade creation, you can say globalization, and this caused over 800, it is estimated, over 800 million Chinese people who were lifted out of absolute poverty due to China trading now and due to China embracing globalization. And of course, with individuals moving out of absolute poverty, that is an example of living standards improving. So I'd get started answering this 25 mark question using this lovely diagram we used in the last question as well. What is this diagram? It's just a tariff diagram and just one added point, which is a closed economy. Now, why is that a closed economy? Since that is where supply by domestic producers matches the demand by domestic consumers perfectly. Thus, what does that mean? There's no need for any imports. But how would I start this chain of analysis? I'll start this chain of analysis by talking about before globalization. So I would say before globalization, economies operated more as a closed economy. So they didn't trade with anyone essentially. So there was very limited imports. But then, and then of course we know some of the causes of globalization: improvements in transport, improvements in technology, and containerization. So there's lots of reasons. And then my next chain of analysis would be, then we had improvements in transport since technology improved, and processes like containerization came into place and came into action, came into fruition, you could say. Therefore, this allowed and this hinted at the start of globalization. This accelerated globalization. And then what happened from there? So when globalization occurred, of course, what was the main thing of globalization? It meant increased integration of economies, therefore the main thing being increased trade. And countries saw this opportunity of trade to improve their economy, improve their living standards. So they reduced things like tariff barriers and fully embraced globalization. And with most countries now embracing globalization, it led to large amounts of international trade, and each country could now access massive international markets. What did this now allow? This allowed the theory and comparative advantage itself. Since now, every country could specialise in a good they had a comparative advantage in a good they had a lower opportunity cost of producing. Why? Since before globalization, countries had to be self-sufficient. They had to make everything themselves. Whereas now with globalization, since they can just trade for the goods, they can specialize. And what do you mean by specialize? They can dedicate more factors of production in the economy to that good. For example, in oil, most of Saudi's GDP is made up of oil, but this is also seen in the demographic of their workers. Most of their workers, most of their machines, most of their factors of production are in oil, since that's what makes them the most money. So by globalization occurring, by increased trade, this almost gave countries a license to dedicate as many factors of production to the goods and services they have a comparative advantage in. As now, instead of having to produce everything, they could just trade for the other goods and just make sure they produce that one good really well. This of course led to massive increases in productivity, and resources were finally being allocated to where they were efficient. As for example, in the UK we saw this with Margaret Thatcher. Of course, she made lots of controversial decisions as Prime Minister. One of the biggest things she did was close the UK coal mines. Why did she do that? As we did not have a comparative advantage in coal mining. And what did we see once she closed the UK coal mines? The production of coal moved to the countries of which had a comparative advantage in. Countries like Australia, I believe, even Russia. They had a much lower opportunity cost of producing coal than the UK. Thus, due to globalization occurring, it gave the UK the license to close down the sectors of the economy that they did not have a comparative advantage in, which allowed them to dedicate more factors of production to, for example, the southern side of the economy, London, to the service sector of the economy, which now is the biggest sector for the UK. Things like financial services, like lawyering services, things like that. Financial and legal services. I don't know why I said lawyering services. But of course, every country, every economy essentially became a powerhouse factory. They became a factory for that one specialised good or service. And this, as the theory of comparative advantage states, it led to, if countries specialised in the goods they had the comparative advantage in, it is increased global output. And if you have increased global output, what does that mean? How do you define GDP? It's gross domestic product. What is product? Is the amount of output. So that to increase world GDP, and an increase in world GDP will therefore lead to an increase in living standards, which of course links directly back to what our point was, which was one impact of globalization is an improvement in living standards, which we have seen. And of course, I gave the example of China's massive improvements in absolute poverty, and of course all around the globe we've seen a massive decrease in levels of absolute and relative poverty. As of course I mentioned earlier, the 800 million of Chinese individuals have been lifted out of absolute poverty due to trade-led growth and due to globalization. But yeah, that is an absolute killer chain of analysis, and killer because it will get you the A star and just top marks. So yeah, that's just a demonstration of how I would do it, and it really shows, of course, you need to be top level with your application, also just being step by step with that chain of analysis, having content mastery. Of course, the live classes will help massively, cheeky plug there, and that is a great example of an absolute top level A star paragraph. Of course, you do need a very good depth of application, and of course content mastery, knowing how to develop a step-by-step chain of analysis. The live classes will help with that. But yeah, let's now move on to the second paragraph, which is the against point. So yes, I think I forgot to mention evaluation there, so let's quickly go through that. So the main evaluation point, and a great evaluation point you could use here, is you could evaluate the characteristics, the assumptions that the theory of comparative advantage is based on. So two big ones are, firstly, the theory of comparative advantage assumes no trade barriers, and then also it assumes no transport costs. And of course, both of these are not very applicable to the real world, since there will be transport costs. And secondly, if you think about Donald Trump, if you think about trade barriers, lots of countries have trade barriers. These distort the theory of comparative advantage, thus limit the degree to which globalization can occur. So that's a really great evaluation. So you could say the improvement in living standards depend on the real world application, the realisticness of the assumptions of the theory of comparative advantage. And then you could go into depth, like for example, Donald Trump's tariffs on China distort theory of comparative advantage, thus it limits the effectiveness, limits the positive effects on living standards that globalization can have. Then other evaluation points you can mention, I mentioned the positives for the different shareholders, but also you can mention the negatives for different shareholders. So of course, for workers, of course, the globalization has led to structural unemployment. You could add, and this is such a great point, you could add to that example we mentioned earlier. So we mentioned earlier, massive positive of Margaret Thatcher closing the mines in the UK as moved to more efficient, more countries that had a less opportunity cost, that had the comparative advantage in it, like Australia. However, then you could mention the negatives of that. However, in evaluation, this depends on the negative effects on the domestic economy, on the domestic workers in the UK, as of course we saw massive structural unemployment. That north versus south divide was just amplified due to that change, since lots of these mines were in the north, and we saw structural unemployment where the structure of the economy changed, where the economy, Margaret Thatcher, or during that time, the economy moved towards more the south side, London, where it was, like I said, financial and legal services, whereas these individuals, they had generations and generations where every single one of their sons, every single daughter was becoming a mine worker. Therefore, with this job just being completely wiped out suddenly, it led to massive levels of structural unemployment. Since, of course, these individuals did not have any skills in any other sector, and like I say, the sector of the economy changed, therefore led to structural unemployment. But of course, there's lots of valuation points, as I always say, to mention here. What I would do, go through your chain of analysis, read through it step by step, and question any assumptions you've made, and that is perfect for evaluation. Why? Because it's specific evaluation. You're specifically evaluating your chain of analysis, and that is what examiners want to see. But yeah, let's move on to the second paragraph. Okay, so second paragraph, like I said, the main paragraph point is overdependence on imports and exports is one of the impacts of globalization, and that's essentially what my my paragraph point would be. One likely impact of globalization, one negative impact of globalization is it has led to global economies becoming overdependent on imports and exports. And would kick it off with the Saudi example. For example, 50% of Saudi GDP is in the oil sector, and over 80%, I think 70%, over 70% of government revenues come from oil. So back to the question. Globalization has allowed for international trade. Firms, nations can now access global markets, which has created a massive profit incentive, and countries have seen the goods they have a comparative advantage in, goods they have a lower opportunity cost of producing, they can of course make more profits from them. Therefore, countries, nations have encouraged firms to dedicate more factors of production to specialise in these goods or services that the country has a comparative advantage in. And the increased number of factors of production in these sectors has led to the economies and different economies around the globe now being vulnerable to external shocks. For example, if there are fluctuations in changes in the price of oil, which there often are, this leads to several fiscal problems for the Saudi Arabia economy, since, like we said, most of the economy is based on oil. And if you really want to, you can add the example I spoke about earlier, which is the Russia gas prices example as well. But overall, by countries becoming over-dependent on imports, like we saw in the UK, like we saw in Europe, due to the increase in gas prices, I think a really interesting start is in Germany, where Germany relied on around 60%, I believe it's 55% of the gas imports were from Russia. And of course, when this was cut off, they were severely, and since they were so over-dependent, they were disproportionately dependent on Russia for their gas imports, they were severely affected. And this had massive impacts. The world's biggest chemical company, which is BASF, they had many plants, many factories in Germany, and they closed many of their factories due to the prices of gas were extremely high. This led to massive job losses. Around 3,000 jobs were lost in Germany, and it led to recessionary pressures where GDP decreased about 0.3%. But overall, globalization has created massive vulnerabilities in these economies, and of course, due to the interdependence of global economies, it means that if one economy is vulnerable, others are vulnerable too, since shocks are translated between different economies, like we saw in the financial crisis, like we saw during COVID-19, like we saw during the Russia-Ukraine war. And then how would we evaluate this? Like I said earlier, a great and a really good applied example. You can evaluate this by, however, in evaluation, this depends on countries' attempts, economies' attempts on diversifying their economy. As you can give a really good applied example, Saudi Vision 2030, they're aiming to diversify their economy, and it's going quite well with encouraging tourism. For example, they're massively investing into sports, like as you might see with the Saudi Pro League. So basically investing into different sectors of the economy to therefore reduce the cost of failure, essentially. So when inevitably oil does run out, Saudi still have economy, they still have transaction, and like we said, just re-diversifying the economy. And of course, like I said, always go through your chain of analysis, find more specific evaluation. Other things, you can just talk about general positives of globalization, like we mentioned earlier, things like governments, how they benefited, increased tax revenue from tariffs. And then like firms like BT, lots of big firms, they've benefited from being able to move labour around. So for example, BT, most of the warehouses, whenever you ring up customer service, they usually pick up from India. Why? Since they've been able to benefit from reduced costs due to relocation. So of course in the UK, very high minimum wage, very high non-wage costs, therefore the cost per worker is extremely high, but due to globalisation they've been able to benefit moving workers abroad, moving workers to a country where wage costs are lower and non-wage costs are lower, thus meaning they save money due to globalisation. So yeah, that's pretty much how I would attempt this 25 mark question. With theme 4 and globalisation questions in particular, I would say with practice this should be some of the easiest 25 mark questions you should do, and with practice there's no excuse to get lower than 20 out of 25 with these questions, which is of course what you need for around the A star. And theme 4, this is a major topic, transform your grade. My 101 students in the past, the live class students, I changed them from being this is a topic they want to avoid, this is a theme they don't like, to this is a theme where it comes up, if they get a 25 mark question on it, they want to do that. They'd rather do a globalisation question than like a fiscal policy, than a monetary policy question. Why? Since we prepare you so well, and it really is, these questions are a lot more simple and a lot more straightforward, and they're very repetitive compared to the other big topics. So yeah, make sure you practice these and you're up to scratch with these, since if something like this comes up, you should be able to absolutely smash it out the park. And that is June 2022, paper 2, the macro paper, done. Any questions, make sure to leave down in the comments, and make sure to check the links in the description for more support with your economics.